Welcome everyone to Collective Intellectualities. This is a podcast produced in conjunction with PISA, which is the Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia, and their new digital venture, PISA Agora, along with the journal Educational Philosophy and Theory. And we are here to explore issues in education, educational theory in our world today. I am Alex Means, joined by Amy Soho, and we are both affiliated with the Department of Educational Foundations at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Be sure to check out all our links below, and there's links to our department and who we are, et cetera, et cetera. So this is our first episode, and we are really excited today to be joined by David Kupferman. He is an assistant professor at Minnesota State University, and he has written a very interesting article in educational philosophy and theory called I, Robot Teacher. And this is a particularly timely intervention given the pandemic and the move to online learning. And it's a reflection on science fiction and future studies, where we are, where we might be going. And so we are really excited and pleased to begin with this because we think it resonates with so many important issues that are taking place today. So welcome, David. And I guess we would begin by allowing you to introduce the piece and telling us a bit about your inspiration for writing it. And we'll give the floor to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Amy. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is a first for me as well. So happy to be part of this. In terms of the article itself, it came kind of in a fit. And I have been working on issues in future studies in education, toying with some ideas. I've had worked on science fiction and childhood and pedagogy, and had published a book last year, an edited collection about that topic, about science fiction. And the more I started to read science fiction and read about science fiction, think about it, the more I started to realize that I had to start thinking about the future. And I think if you read science fiction, unless you're reading a lot of historical science fiction, it's really difficult to avoid thinking about what the world will look like. And that's maybe a very human thing to do. You know, I mean, future studies, futures planning, you know, you think about things like agriculture, like that's planning for the future. Reproduction is planning for the future. Education is planning for the future. Science fiction is just this window into all these multiple possible, some probable, some preferable, some very utopian, some very dystopian futures. And so I started to think more about that in terms of what was happening at the moment. And so the fit I'm talking about is this idea of how do I do this? My institution had spring break, like most did, and got an email in March of 2020. We're going to take 2 extra weeks to spring break, so you can put everything you've been doing online. Now, this was all sort of overnight. I think a lot of people had this experience in academia. I think this sort of took people by surprise, which is an important point, because we hadn't considered this. I know that a trend in higher education recently has been moving things online. And there's been a push for online learning and offering sections of courses for non-traditional students, students who aren't in the area, students who work maybe during the day and could do something asynchronous. And then there have been business models behind this as well. People looking at, Western Governors University as a model, looking at Phoenix, looking at some of these online universities as exemplars of how to, you know, maximize efficiency in the dollar. But then this pandemic happened. It was kind of slow moving. Everyone saw it coming, you know. The fact that we went online in March was both surprising and not surprising at all. But I had been thinking about moving my courses online anyway, just to try it for a section or two to see if that was possible. And I'm not trained in online teaching. And I'm sure that most university professors are not trained specifically in online teaching. And beyond that, our students aren't trained in taking a class online. So they also don't know what to expect. And so I had been reading some Asimov. I had been speaking with Amy and a couple other interlocutors about science fiction generally. And I just felt like, wait, I'm being asked not just to be tech support now, but I'm asked to really be a robot teacher. I'm asked to be like the human input behind Jill, you know, the AI TA at Georgia Tech from a couple of years ago. So I was really in sort of, I was in a state of being able to think about it, but not really knowing where to go with it. And the one thing I had learned from taking maybe a professional development course on teaching online learning was don't try to simply transplant what you're doing in the classroom onto an online platform. It's not going to translate. So then what am I doing? Right. And I had to return to some inspiration, you know, some oldies but goodies. And that Asimov short story, The Fun They Had, which is one that I've read a while ago and I'd written about in another context, really just sort of seemed like, wait, Isaac Asimov had figured this out. He had already described March of 2020 in 1951. And it not, you know, in every detail, but this idea of what is it about teachers and the idea of a human teacher versus a robot teacher being taught by an algorithm, being taught, what if you have learning disabilities? What about issues of access and equity? Who has access to these? I mean, these are all questions that we're now talking about since March, right? So all of these concepts are now coming to the fore. Asimov had this down, you know, 1951, my math is not very good, 70 years ago, practically. So but what really got me thinking about this was we don't take that seriously. We don't actually see that as a model that we should be anticipating. Science fiction, especially, I think in academia, gets sort of sent to the margins. There's a healthy debate about science fiction in academia, but it's not one that I think the majority of academics would want to enter into. And I give some reasons in the article for why that might be. You know, one is it's popular, and it's popular culture, and therefore it's not something that academics necessarily feel comfortable talking about, because we like to talk about our specialties, right? And if everyone is able to access science fiction, it's not necessarily something that we can theorize on the spot. So that's really what kind of got me started with the article, was trying to figure out, wait, Asimov had done this. He had thought about this. Okay, so then this suggests...
David, maybe tell us a little bit about the short story, what its title is, and and maybe some of the specificities and how you sort of build on that.
Sure. Because it is like it is a great short story.
Yeah, and it's very short. It's
super short.
It was originally published in a children's magazine, and it's written for children. And it's called The Fun They Had. It's about two kids, and Tommy and Margie. And Margie is younger than Tommy. Tommy's about 13. Margie's a little younger. And it's a typical school day in 2157, which is about 200 years out from where Asimov was writing. And when I say school day, I mean just a day, because school doesn't exist. School it consists entirely of humans, child's interaction with a computer, and whatever that interface is, and whatever that computer's database is. So Margie, her computer is on the fritz. And so Tommy comes over, and he was rummaging around in his house and found a book. And the book was all about school, this thing called school from a couple centuries ago. And the idea that there were humans that were teachers, and that children got together during the day and learned together. And then, that then goes to the title, the fun they had, right? School was a place where children had fun. Oh, and that's how the story ends. You know, Margie keeps thinking about, oh, the fun they must have had, you know, way back when, before we had this particular scenario. So Margie's computer is on the fritz. You learn about, Margie has some learning issues. She has some learning ability issues. She hates her robot teacher. There's someone who has come in to fix it. So humans are there in the education process to maintain the hardware, but not to actually deliver any kind of knowledge or content. And so Margie gets called back in because the repairman fixed the computer. So now she has to go back to quote unquote school. Now her school day has to begin, and she hates it. And so she has to go back inside, and Tommy goes to his school, which is his robot teacher. But there's all kinds of questions in there. So there's questions of pedagogy, there's questions of access, there's questions of special education, inclusive education. Who are the people behind these robot teachers? Who's developing the databases of content knowledge? I mean, these are questions we can ask about education, you know, the term of content knowledge anyway. But this idea of socialization, the key element of socialization as a function of the experience of school. And just the idea that this is the way that it's pitched in the short story as a benefit is that the robot teacher can, on the fly, adapt to any student's learning style, right? So it's that ideal individualized learning. And yet, this girl, Margie, hates it. And it's not actually getting to where she needs, you know, where it needs to get to be able to connect with her. So there are all of these, I mean, and this is maybe, it fits on a one page of a PDF. Like there's so much in this story, and it's so accessible. It's literally written for children, so there's no jargon whatsoever. But it does beg any number of questions about education policy, education philosophy, what we're doing, and then issues of online learning, issues of technology, issues of access and equity, you know, all the things that we're now struggling with during the pandemic. You know, you hear about children who are sitting in the parking lot at McDonald's because they have Wi-Fi at McDonald's and they don't have any at home, you know, or children are in the parking lot at a school, and the school is like trying to expand their broadband, you know, from the parking lot at school, or children who just have disappeared, who just don't attend. And then that's, and so now you have this sort of permanent dropout class that no one has any good ideas for. And that's without addressing children like, I mean, my own kids. You know, I have a kid in 7th grade and I have a daughter in 7th grade and I have a daughter in 4th grade. And it's just not the same. It's just not the same. And it's, you know, we talk about the achievement gap. We talk about, you know, growth over a school year. I mean, I can't wait for the studies to come out to see, you know, the majority of children in the country, I'm sure, are not growing as they were over the course of a typical school year during this year, because we just aren't ready for it.
So I heard a story of a 7th grader who had missed 3 online Zoom sessions, and I think this was in California, and the family received a notice that the child and the parents could be subject to arrest if they weren't, you know, if they weren't more dutifully showing up and attending these Zoom sessions. So there's some interesting ways that this is being enforced. But in terms, you're talking a bit about access and equity. You're talking about the missing element of human relations. And I think that you're getting at this idea that, you know, this fully online environment is missing a couple of key elements. One, the idea of, you know, education could actually be joyful, as you mentioned with the kids in the Asimov story, perhaps like with rose-colored glasses are looking back at school being fun. I don't know if school is necessarily always fun, but maybe it should be. And then the issues of access and inequality, when I was reading your piece, this is definitely something that came to mind. because what I really, and perhaps this could be a way of moving into talking a little bit about future studies and what that means and why it can be useful for thinking about some of these issues, and also science fiction. But when I think about equity and digital learning, I'll just say for the record that I'm quite skeptical about robot teachers. I'm quite skeptical about learning analytics. You were talking about the Asimov story, that it's a predictive machine. And we could talk about some of the examples of adaptive analytics and learning. It's based, anyway, I'm losing the thread a little bit here myself, but the issues of access and equity, the skepticism that I'm talking about, I actually think that if we were to project outward, what we'll see is that human teachers will be for rich kids. And it's really the digital learning that'll be for downwardly mobile, middle income people, lower income people, and dispossessed classes in the society. So I don't know. I'd like to hear a little bit of your thoughts on that. So access to online learning could actually be detrimental. It's the access to the human element that could be anyway a dividing line. So I'm wondering what
And maybe if I can tie into that, because I think this is a really good opportunity, because I remember when you're referring to that podcast, David, with the Jill, the AI, the GA AI, and then also how they have, right, in your article, you talk about, right, the access to digital learning when they have the computers, and I think, was it India, where they had it?
Yeah, the hole in
right,
the wall.
the hole in the wall. But also, so when we're thinking about learning analytics, I think also too, what's a really good thing with the fund they had is when we're thinking about access is that the robot teachers also, it's tracking, right? It's tracking margin, and it's creating these false tracks. So she's just disengaged with school and is thinking, okay, well, you're dumb because you're not getting the right answers. So we have to put you on another track. So when we're thinking about in the real life and this world, I think about the questions, right, of access and online learning analytics, and that is, right, probably the probable, where human teachers are for those who can afford to have a personal educator that comes into their private pods for whatever neighborhood, and then the digital becomes, right, the probable for those who can't afford it. But when you're thinking, I think this is what's really cool, David, with your piece, I, Robot Teacher, and you're thinking, well, what if we had a robot teacher? So if that's the probable, if we see with the world going with robot teachers, what for you then also would be the preferable and the possible?
Right. So maybe I could take a step back and just sort of walk through future studies as a framework, just sort of lay that foundation for folks, for people who aren't really familiar with it. And I think future studies is, I mean, for those who aren't familiar with it, it came out of really military war games in the 1940s. And so this idea of the Delphi technique was developed by the Rand Corporation in 1953, really for war games initially, and then it was applied to corporate futures, and then financial futures, and organizational futures, and so on. And so, but it really, future studies as an academic field really didn't coalesce until the 1980s, 1990s, with work by Wendell Bell, Jim Dater at University of Hawaii. He's sort of the I don't know, one of them's John Lennon, and the other one's Paul McCartney for future studies. So, and then it's sort of taken off from there as a theoretical framework. And so there's a lot to unpack there. And a lot of folks who deal in future studies spend a lot of time in that theoretical framework. And I don't find that particularly helpful for me in thinking through this, but I do like the way that they've come up with, Wendell Bell really has distilled this idea of thinking of possible futures, thinking of multiple futures. You have what's probable, you have what's possible, you have what's preferable, right? There are other versions that you can that folks look at, but I think those three categories are really helpful. So the probable, what do I think is going to happen? Yeah, I think before we get to robot teachers and we have that inequity of access and the continuing gap between rich and poor and middle class in America. I mean, I think we see that happening in higher education, right? So you have elite institutions, liberal arts institutions, Ivy League, and so on. More and more are the ones that for folks who can afford it. And then you have this sort of large middle of institutions, state institutions, land grant institutions, and so on, that are moving in the direction of workforce development. You know, they're shedding the liberal arts. I mean, the pandemic is sort of laying this bare. And even, I mean, there was an article, I believe in the Chronicle, by someone from Johns Hopkins who was bringing this to light at Johns Hopkins, which is absolutely an elite institution, that there were all these budget cuts. And so now we're going to use the pandemic as an excuse to cut things like liberal arts and so on. And we're going to focus on workforce development. And then that workforce development piece is going to be pushed online more and more. And we see that happening. And then you have sort of the for-profit online world of higher education, which is really there for credentialing more than anything else, right? It's not about a university education. It's not about maybe what, Alex, you and I are probably close to the same age. It's not what our generation was told about the value of a university education, and so we already see that split. We already see that happening. So, in terms of post-pandemic, that's just going to become more stark. So that's going to happen there. That may actually serve as a model for this, when technology begins to really ramp up in terms of its application and its deployment in public education in schools. Yeah, then we may see that modeling what's already happening at the university level. In terms of that I would put under the probable category. What's possible? I think there are a couple of things that are possible, and I'm not sure if they're good or bad. One of them is certainly a complete intrusion of technology into the process. So one possibility could be human teachers sort of go by the wayside, or they're an elite cadre, and then the rest of us are sort of looking for other jobs because we've been replaced by robot teachers, to say nothing of our education students, right, who are going to go out into K-12. It's possible. I think learning platforms and the proliferation of iPads, of hardware and software, and humans may be in the room as teachers, but our judgment and our ability to engage in pedagogy and relationship with students will be replaced by technology. We will be relegated to some sort of tech support, right? As the student engages with that predictive model on that Apple developed software, that adaptive software for those kids. This is already happening. This has been happening in Chicago for the last 4 or 5 years. Leap Innovations is one organization that's been doing that. Rahm Emanuel had made sure that there were these incubators for education, and he offered up large swaths of Chicago public schools as sort of labs for students, largely students of color, largely students in the South Side, low-income neighborhoods, to be guinea pigs, to be beta testing the software for Apple, for Google, for these these companies. So all these things are already kind of happening. I think it's possible that actually then explodes. What would be preferable? I don't know. The United States becomes Denmark. I have the crisis of leisure that John Maynard Keynes wrote about 85 years ago. I work a 15-hour work week. And then school is divorced from workforce development and employment. By the same token, so is healthcare. So, that would be preferable. Preferable would be, Marx is a Renaissance man. I can wake up in the morning and be a poet. In the afternoon, I can be a firefighter. And in the evening, I can be a carpenter, and the preferable is really about tapping into creativity. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of part of the key to being human, right? Is to be able to engage in creative pursuits. And that element has really been limited, if not entirely erased, from everything we're talking about right now. Forget about in the future. You know, I mean, if you look at a typical teacher education program for an undergraduate in this country has very little room for electives or creativity or thinking outside of EdTPA or PPAT or licensure. I mean, you know, again, it's going back to that loss of the liberal arts, you know. So, yeah, I mean, so in terms of a framework to think of these things, I think future studies gives me that. What future studies in education, I think, is missing is this creative turn. And I think if you read academic articles, if you read policy publications about educational futures that come out of the UN, that come out of UNESCO, that come out of the EU and out of places like the RAND Corporation and so on, Brookings Institute has a number as well. It's not creative. It's about sort of replicating what's happening right now and making it more efficient. And I don't know that that's actually preferable. And so when I think about future studies in this framework, I think, wait, there's all this other thinking we could be doing. It's that creative thinking. You know, it's not about how we get there. It's not about predicting the future. The Delphi technique is about predicting the future, right? That's what military exercises are for, right? What future studies in education, I think, should be doing is anticipating the future. And that anticipation exists in science fiction in a way that it doesn't exist anywhere else, especially in academic writing. And so that Asimov piece is just one example. And so the iRobot teacher, of course, comes from iRobot. You know, that's the inspiration for it. And the 3 laws of robotics, and then the Zeroth law of robotics that Asimov played with over the years and has been talked about in academic writing. It's been sort of critiqued. It's been held up as you know, an exemplary. It's been used to actually influence and inspire actual technological, you know, AI companies and technological development. People have referred back to those robot laws. And so you know, my question is, why aren't we thinking about that in terms of robot teachers or about these issues of, you know, human teachers, right? Being accessible only to a small group of wealthy students, right? So then what about the ethics behind all this? And really what this is, these are all ethical questions, right? These are questions about what we value. These are questions about, you know, whose interests are being served and who's being left out in these conversations. It has everything to do about the future of things like restorative justice, for example, or transformational justice, or social justice, or economic justice, right? Because what we don't ask about typically when we have those conversations is, okay, so let's play this out. Let's say, for example, Betsy DeVos, who may or may not be the Secretary of Education much longer, and I would argue that it doesn't matter because she's not the issue. She's representative of this other set of ideas that has taken hold in education coming from the neoliberal project, right? So let's say it's Betsy DeVos, or it's the next person, or the person after that. Let's say that they get their wish. Let's say we have a complete defunding of public schools, right? And all that public tax money is now in private schools. And the only way to access a private school is through vouchers. And we can play this out, right? You can think about this scenario. Okay, so then what does it actually look like in 20 years or 30 years for students of color, for students who come from low-income housing, or low-income neighborhoods, or students who are living in poverty or homelessness, Native American students who live on reservations, who really don't have any access at all. Public education is flawed, absolutely. I would argue it's flawed because we've never actually funded it appropriately. But, you know, let's assume not even that is available, right? Let's play that out. Now what happens to the conversation about economic justice or restorative justice? Flip it around. Let's say we actually are able to achieve a state where schools as political institutions are actually places for restorative justice or social justice, or racial justice. What does that look like 20 or 30 years from now? Right, we don't think about these. We're stuck in either today or 20 years ago, right? And we're trying to get through today in terms of teacher education programs specifically. we're not actually training teachers to be teachers in 2050. We're training them to be teachers in 2005, right? And so the question is why? Why don't we? And then what would that look like? What does it look like? Hey, let's turn to science fiction. I'll give you a bunch of different examples. And I would say that the thing about science fiction is that, you know, Octavia Butler has this quote, and I'm going to mangle it, but it's about science fiction allowed me to think about science, but then stick my nose in everywhere. And that's really what science fiction is. Science fiction is, for me, the liberal arts. It's science, it's math, it's literature, it's the visual arts, it's imagination, it's creativity, it's music, it's the human experience bottled up in this very specific context, right? It's probably a futuristic context. What does it say about where we are now? What does it say about where we want to go? And then what does it say about how we can actually anticipate these possibilities?
David, I would like to just take a moment and read to you a quote by the great scholar David Kupferman, because I think that this is a great quote from your piece, and I think it gets at what you're talking about. You write, "So science fiction, while often futuristic, is really a mirror held up to where we are right now. It is a way to think about today through the medium of some kind of future. It is not really what the future looks like that matters so much as how we envision it given our current moment." And I'm wondering, given what you're saying, how does that perspective or lens of thinking about the future through science fiction, how does that lend itself to rethinking education, but also education in relation to these problems of the extraction of liberal arts, the extraction of sort of the relational aspects of it, particularly in a moment where we're looking at future trajectories of ecological crisis that I think are very much on people's minds. And the workforce development piece, the economic growth piece, thank you for bringing back in this notion that we're living in a neoliberal context where we're hyper-atomized. Inequality is radically intensifying. And we think in terms of the short term, maybe because economic logic has so colonized the way we think about the social, because we think about the social just through the individual's competitive acquisition of credentials through education as a jobs, as a cash for credentials for jobs transfer, and where these things get extracted and lost. And I'm wondering, is there a way in which thinking through this science fiction perspective helps us to, I'm asking I think I'm asking a lot of questions at once, but I think I'll just leave it at, I'll leave it at that and see what your response is.
So if I can maybe distill that, how does science fiction help us think through what we're doing right now? Is that sort of
yeah, and also, I mean, how does it enable us to rethink education out of this place where education has been so devalued in relation to these broader ethical, moral, aesthetic, imaginative, and creative pursuits that you're talking about? How does it help us recover that in a way that might point toward, some sort of way forward?
Yeah, I think that's sort of the million-dollar question, and if I had that answer, I would have written that paper too. I think I'm certainly working on it. So I think I would answer this with a couple of different examples. So in the social imaginary, in terms specifically of how education is viewed by science fiction, it's extremely boring for the most part. It's the Jetsons, right? Jetsons and the robot teacher, Miss Brainmocker, right? We don't actually there aren't a lot of examples of educational futures in science fiction. No one has really written about that. You get little snippets of it here and there. And largely they're about, they have to do with technology. So I'll give you just a few. So if the movie Ready Player One, right? But actually not the movie, the book, if you read the book, Ready Player One. The main character goes to school through VR, right? And that's entirely in a neoliberal context. right? Because it's about how many points you can earn and how much money he has, and he's living in the stacks in Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio, I believe, and which is where most people can afford to live there. So that's one example, right? So there's this element of technology that's sort of on steroids, right? Now I'm going to go to school through VR. We're probably not too far away from that. Another example is the Matrix, cortical knowledge upload. You literally plug your brain into a computer, right? I know Kung Fu. But even in the I know Kung Fu scene, in the simulation, Neo and Morpheus still have to fight. And there's still a space for an avatar, at least, of a human teacher in that dojo, right? And then Morpheus has that great line, I can only show you the door, you have to walk through it. I mean, that's everyone's philosophy of education, right? When they get down to it, right? So there's this sort of idea of technology as not necessarily the answer, but certainly the avenue where we're going to go. There's not a lot else out there. I think there's one short story that I read from a book a couple years ago by Kathleen Ann Goonan called Girl and Wave, Wave and Girl. And it's about a girl who is post-human. This is 100 years in the future. And society has essentially genetically engineered learning disabilities out of people. And then they begin to add enhancements. So now she has wings. She's talking to her grandmother, who was one of the first people to get this surgery, this genetic, you think about it, this is all possible now with, the Nobel Prize in I believe it was physiology, went to the scientists working on the CRISPR gene editing, right? So this is all, none of the reality is actually science fiction, right? So it may be possible in decades or so for us to genetically engineer special education and inclusive education out, right? It just may not be necessary. But it's such an interesting story because it's all about the ethics of posthumanism and, do we want to do genetic editing of humans and so on, all the conversations we're having now. But I don't know that there's actually an example out there of the idea of neoliberalism and education reform and education policy as it stands. So I think we have to write it. And I think that's what I'm hoping that I'm able to do and that I'm able to kind of get others to do, to maybe create a space. And I'll put up, I'm working on a few projects that are actually looking at this. So I'm trying to actually look at these issues. And one of the projects is a special issue for Policy Futures in Education, asking folks to imagine one of these scenarios, the probable, the possible, the preferable, and actually, use it as an opportunity to be creative and write creatively, draw from science fiction. And what does this look like? What do these things look like? What is this? What is the role of education in a world of climate change when we've gone beyond all of the red lines in 2030 and 2040 and 2050? People, I'm old enough to think that 2050 is science fiction, but then I look at my students in my classes and they're going to be teaching in 2050, if there's still such a thing as school, but if things continue as they are, they're going to be at, middle end of their careers. This is not something that's going to happen outside of my lifetime. So, I don't know what the role of education is once we have a climate disaster, once we start to have climate refugees in numbers that really overwhelm systems. Nobody saw the pandemic come and what that would do immediately, except for Octavia Butler. She wins the office pool for the pandemic, right? And so that's that other article that I wrote for Access, that short editorial about speech sounds, her short story Speech Sounds, writing in a pandemic. And so what is the effect of the pandemic going to be? I don't think we're even going there. I think what most people think is in 2021, more likely 2022, everyone's vaccinated or everyone's had herd immunity or whatever it is, allows us to get back out into society and into each other's faces and spaces. and everything's kind of just go back to normal. I think most people think that's what's going to happen. And we're going to be back in education doing a lot of autopsies about ESSA, because that'll be replaced by a new version of the education law. And then we'll still be talking about closing the achievement gap, closing the inequity gap. We'll still be talking about access to material things like Wi-Fi and computers and so on. We'll still be talking about racial injustices. We'll be talking about trying to get to a space of transformational justice. I think that's where most people think we're going to wind up, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, and then what? And then we just kind of continue on the trajectory we're on.
It just seems, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I think listening to you is helping me sort of clarify my question that I was trying to ask before, which is like, it seems like this kind of thinking, this kind of creative thinking about the future is precisely what should be centered in school, in the curriculum, in design, in engineering, in philosophy, in the arts, in economics, across these different fields, and of course ecology, the natural sciences. These things need to all be brought together, but they need to be brought together for students so that they can not only imagine the world that they're going to be living in 30 years from now, but to be able to develop capacities for the ways in which they might work together, to not go into maybe the dystopian versions of what's probable, but the preferable ones that they have. And I mean, it seems to me that one of the great historical tragedies of neoliberalism in relation to its elimination of the liberal arts is it's coming right at this moment of such a magnitude of intersecting crises. And we have a population completely, and I'm speaking here specifically of the United States, and of course this is a very specific context, and other contexts are a little bit different. However, we have a population that education is not a vector through which you not only imagine the probable futures that we're describing, but creatively think through how we might avoid the worst case scenarios. So that's just one, I'm just saying all this because that's one of the aspects of your piece that I find so valuable, is I think it really raises that question. And I'm just, or that set of questions and issues. I'm just wondering what you think about that.
That's a great question. And those are some great points. I think some of these things are happening. So some of this great futures thinking is happening in things like architecture, in art and design, in public spaces. It's happening both for good and for ill. You know, I mean, Google pulled out of that city that they were going to do in Toronto. You know, they wanted to have.
Oh, right.
But that's where the future.
Have you written about that, David? Or am I confusing?
I did write about it in a piece in terms of surveillance.
Okay.
The way that it operates with surveillance. But Google pulled out of that city, right? I forget what the name of it was, that waterfront part of Toronto.
Yeah.
And so that's where the futures thinking is happening, but it's happening in spaces, it's happening in architecture, it's happening in political science. I think it's happening in political theory. I think it's happening certainly in the arts. It's happening in places like Afrofuturism. You know, that's really exciting to see. It's not something that I can contribute to for obvious reasons, but it's certainly another venue where that kind of thinking is happening. It's not happening in education, I think, for all the reasons that you're saying. And you know, I've done a little bit of this in some of my classes with undergraduates, where I ask them to try to envision, okay, 2050, what do you want to see? What would you love? What would be the preferable? Forget about the other two. Forget about possible or probable. And invariably, it's all stuck in today. We're going to close the achievement gap. We're going to, we're going to fully fund public schools, and, we're going to have equity and so on and so forth. But there isn't any actual thinking about what the world is going to look like. And I think it's because it's a frightening prospect. It's frankly a scary thing to think about. And science fiction is frightening on a lot of levels, dystopian or otherwise. Even utopian stuff is a little scary, right? And even the utopian stuff is dystopian. That's what Aldous Huxley showed us, right? So, I mean, it's a great question, you know. So why aren't we doing that in our education courses? I think it's the reasons that we've already spoken about. It's because students need to pass a test. They need to get licensed. They need to go out and get a job, because it's actually workforce development. It's not actually teacher education the way it was 100 years ago. You know, if you look at a normal school's curriculum from 1920, it's algebra, it's Latin, it's science, it's the arts, you know, it's pedagogy. It's not methods, it's not, you know, it's not classroom management, it's not behavior, it's not, you know, ed psych in the sense that, you know, children are a problem that need to be solved. It's the liberal arts, you know. And so I think if you took someone from 1920 and plucked them into a teacher ed program in 2020, they would have no idea what you're talking about. They would literally be on another planet. That's why we don't do it in education. And I think part of the reason is because, I think academics should be thinking more creatively about these things. I mean, part of how I got into science fiction in the first place was about 5 years ago. I was teaching an ed policy course for graduate students, and I was looking for a story, because I'm from the liberal arts. I grew up in the liberal arts, and that's where my undergraduate is. And so I was looking for a story to explain policy, to explain No Child Left Behind, to explain Race to the Top, to explain some of these shifts. And I came upon this Girl and Wave and Girl story. And I gave it to the students, and it was like something just turned on in them. They didn't necessarily know what to do with it, but it was such a great alternative text. And it got me thinking that really we need to broaden our idea of what is a text. We need to broaden our idea of what is an object of inquiry. And so what science fiction shows us is everything is an object of inquiry. Everything becomes the text, right? And so, you know, an Asimov essay on robot teachers, or a short story like the fun they had, becomes a legitimate text for students to really dive into, right? If we can do that, maybe we can start having these conversations. You know, it's going beyond bringing popular culture and culture studies into the classroom. It's really taking and it's really theorizing science fiction texts as worthy of academic inquiry. And I don't know that enough of us do that. And we don't do enough of it, certainly. And so if we could begin to infuse that and teach our students how to do that for their own students when they're in the classroom, to let them know that, you know, I'm going to give you permission to do this. That's what science fiction is. It's permission to think creatively. And I think I wrote about that, I think, in the Access piece about Nothing But Futures. That Octavia Butler story is permission to think about not how the pandemic happened, not who's at fault, not what life is like during the pandemic, but about what comes after the pandemic. That's the ethical question. Why aren't we thinking about post-pandemic, right? And I don't know that we can think outside of that capitalist realist notion of neoliberalism as sort of sucking all the oxygen out of the room. You know, you put it much more eloquently. But neoliberalism's not going anywhere. You know, capitalism's not disappearing. But what if it did? You know, I'm not suggesting that we have there's a path to it. I think there are ways to make that happen, and I think it's incumbent upon folks to look at the example of the thought collectives of neoliberalism and take those as exemplars. You know, if Milton Friedman proved nothing, it's that universities are ripe for co-optation. And so that's where we should be operating from as academics. But we need to start thinking about what that would look like, you know. So there are dystopian ways to look at it. There are utopian ways to look at it. You know, you can take an accelerationist standpoint, you know, maybe a left accelerationist, not a right accelerationist, but that left accelerationist, that sort of Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams perspective, which is, hey, why don't we accelerate through we push through, we get to a post-capitalist moment. But what does that look like? What does that look like? Or let's say we actually make the right decisions. Let's say in that preferable scenario, we figure it out. Let's say, we're not, unfortunately, the United States doesn't have a political system that's set up for this. It's extremely conservative. It's extremely resistant to change. And so things take way too long to happen, even though we know better. And we're suffering under a tyranny of the minority. And that's baked into the cake, right? But let's say we were able to abolish the Electoral College. We got rid of the Supreme Court. Let's say AOC is president, and Alex, you're the Secretary of Education. But let's have these like fascinating scenarios. Let's say we get to a post-work, post-capitalist world. Well, what does it look like, right? We spend a lot of time analyzing. We spend a lot of time cutting up the patient and diagnosing what the problem is. But there's not a lot of prognosis. There's not a lot of, here, do this, and, in 6 months, it's going to look like that. We don't do that in education. For all the reasons you were saying, and for all the reasons we were talking about, because we really can't see more than beyond our toes. And part of it is capture, the neoliberal capture.
Yeah, sorry, no, I think it's actually really great because, David, how you're speaking to, it's just the ethical stakes of cultivating creativity in schools, right? And how making it just okay to be creative. But also I think a component listening to you talk is also cultivating that sense of wonder with being curious, right, about the possibilities. Right, so being creative, curious, and wonder, and being okay with, what, maybe some things aren't going to work out when we're thinking of sci-fi. A lot of things do not work out. I mean, and thinking about how you're talking about with creativity and wonder, like if we take the movie Snowpiercer, what would education look like after that?
That's a great question. That's a great example.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, when we're thinking through, and I think you also do that too with in I, Robot Teacher with the zeroth law, where I like how you center it where it's, and I'm quoting, the development of creativity as part of the human experience.
Yeah.
Right. And then seeing right now in the current state with how things are, where we're all online, it becomes even more of an obstacle of how do you encourage that creativity across this screen right now that we're talking through, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, you're right. We're violating that law, right, as we speak in our education courses, because we're not centering that creative experience, the way that we can imagine how we want to construct reality as part of what it means to be human, right? And so I think, these are pieces of a larger project in terms of what I'm thinking about. And maybe if I could transition a little bit to that. The part of this is trying to translate some of this for my own students and try to incorporate some of this into my own coursework. But part of it is also to maybe just lay a foundation for that space to open up and to give people permission to imagine, right? So the iRobot Teacher sort of was the first foray into that. And it's sort of my 18th premiere of Louis Bonaparte. I wrote it in a fit of pique. And then the Nothing But Futures is providing yet another layer to that, and also bringing in more, and another example. I mean, Octavia Butler, wonderful, right? And I mean, Asimov is great, but there is diversity in science fiction that I think people are now beginning to recognize that typically hasn't been the focus of the conversation before. N.K. Jemisin just won a MacArthur Genius Grant. Octavia Butler was the first, right? Science fiction writer, woman of color, science fiction writer, and I believe woman of color to get a MacArthur Genius Grant. Right? So there's some recognition of that. There's this renaissance in Native American science fiction, right? That's sort of exploding right You have Ted Chiang. You have a lot of science fiction from China that's being translated into English for the first time. You have works by like Sheena Melville, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have Cory Doctorow. You've got Don DeLillo, right? We have Ian McEwan with his Machines Like Me, book. So you do, but there's just there's this unbelievably broad and deep well of literature and experiences and possibilities that exists. And so part of what I was trying to do with Nothing But Futures is to just sort of say, look, here's a short story by Octavia Butler. It's a brilliant story. And it's brilliant for these 4 or 5 reasons. One of them is it's about a pandemic. Another is it's about people who can't communicate. And I think that in part of what I'm trying to write about there is that academics are having a hard time communicating with each other because we're so heavily reliant on sort of the formula of theorizing everything. So, and I see this when I do reviews. When I review for AERA, when I review for journals, it's a lot of, I'm going to take Foucault and plop, I'm going to plop this essay from Foucault into this geographical context. And it answers everything. It explains everything, or like Deleuze is now the sort of theorist du jour in educational theory, right? Deleuze does not explain every single habit and practice in a school as much as we would like him to. And I'm as guilty of this as
close.
I know, but people are trying to make that case. People are really trying to make that case.
Get into my own biases, but anyway, yeah.
But it's this idea that if we can move away from that and look for theory elsewhere. Octavia Butler has great theory. Asimov has great theory. That one short story, The Fun They Had, really sort of, turned into this article and then this other bigger project, right? There's good theory in there. Another example I gave was Marvel Comics, What If? What a great structure. What if Spider-Man had joined the Fantastic Four? What if Wolverine had become the king of the vampires, right? What if the Hulk had Bruce Banner's brain, right? So why can't we apply that to ourselves? For utopian and dystopian examples. What if Betsy DeVos wins and gets her wish, right? What if Mark Zuckerberg buys Pearson? There's a what if for you, right? That's probably probable. I don't think that's possible. I think that's probable. I'm waiting for Google or Facebook or Apple to buy Pearson, to buy Kaplan Testing, to buy Houghton Mifflin, start buying publishing companies, textbook publishing companies, right? Or Amazon, God forbid Jeff Bezos becomes the arbiter of EdTPA, right? And licensure for education around the country. So, what if? That's a great opportunity. That's a great option. Choose your own adventure. These books from when I was a kid. Alex, I'm sure you remember these growing up. Amy, I'm sure you're familiar with them. I know you are.
I love them.
But it's all these possible, if you go this way, this happens. If you go that way, this happens. It's this pre-factual thinking. It's not knowing what you're going to do and then seeing what the outcome is, right? It's as opposed to counterfactual thinking. Like if I had done this differently in the past, then this would be different in the future. And then that short piece by Octavia Butler, it's permission. It's permission to think about the future. It's permission to be creative. It's permission to write. Actually create the future through writing it. And it's fun. It's permission to have fun. Octavia Butler is so much more fun to read than a policy brief from the Brookings Institute on educational futures. So we need to start applying these other theoretical frameworks that don't exist in traditional academic intellectual conversations about theory. We need to start applying them because there are already so many millions of examples out there if we know where to look. So that's sort of what I was trying to do with these two pieces. The special issue of Policy Futures is an opportunity to get others to write in that space. And I've been pleasantly surprised with the response. People are coming from all corners. And I mean, folks who I know of, who I would otherwise have no reason to be in touch with. Hey, this is great. This is it's an idea that I think is getting to people because they're in a place where they can't actually do this kind of work for the reasons we've been talking about. And so here's license to do it. Here's permission, right? And then I'm also working on the sort of larger piece is I'm working on a book offering 5 futures of education. And so looking at 5 different scenarios of what's possible, what's probable, what's possible, and what's preferable. And so I'm working on that. And it really is about these issues of, what are we, it's about the immediate issues, and then it's about those longer term issues. It's about what do we do about racial injustices? What do we do about technology in the classroom? What do we do about inclusive education? But then it's also, what do we do about, this unsustainable economic model that we're going to collapse under sooner rather than later? It may happen. It may take another century, right? We'll muddle along, and there'll be this continued immiseration for the bulk of the population of the planet. But I guess it's maybe what I'm looking at is trying to find a way to think strategically about being creative, about what various futures could look like, both in response to where we are and in response to where we think we want to be. So, I'd love to get to that post-capitalist, I'd love to be Danish, right? I'll just say, I'd love to be Danish, right? But I'd also like to be in that world where, the bulk of my time in life is being able to attend to creative pursuits. It's to produce things. It's to imagine things. And it's to do that with other people. It's not something that I just want to do on my own. It's something that I have to do in conjunction with others.
Well, it seems to me that the one question that's, we've talked about ethics, and perhaps, the one question that's not really been raised here is politics, which is we can imagine things, and we can exalt creativity through our imaginative, future studies work. But transformation requires solidarity, and it requires actually, it requires antagonism, because we live in structures of hierarchy and power. So I'm wondering a little bit about how those specific issues how you think about those in relation to some of the things that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think, I said earlier, we, in the United States, we have a politics that's just not up to the task. It's just too constraining. And the fix has been in from the beginning. But there's a playbook for shifting the way people think about things. And it's the neoliberal playbook. It's the Mont Pelerin Society. It's those secondhand dealers. It's the academic institutions. It's the media personalities. It's shifting what we think of as common sense. The problem with the dialogue and the discourse today politically in the United States, and I think in other countries as well, especially in the West, that are dealing with some of these issues with neoliberal reforms, is that what passes for common sense is not at all intuitive. It's manufactured. It's all been completely manufactured, right? So issues of choice. Well, how can you, except when it comes to abortion, but we don't want to talk about that contradiction. But, in terms of school choice, how do you argue with choice? How do you argue with lower taxes in Grover Norquist? Like, there has been this concerted effort in this country since the 1950s to not just deregulate the state, not just defund the public sector, and not just privatize the commons and extract profit from the public body. There's been a really successful shift in the conversation. We're smart, we're educated academics. Why can't we do that? Right?
Because the left has not understood the educational or pedagogical content of politics as well as the right has. Sorry to give you like a clear prescriptive answer. Your thought there, but that would be my perspective. So I think quite a lot of what you're saying in terms of science fiction, futures thinking, you know, the absence of that kind of creativity in our educational institutions is a really important issue when we think about that in relation to people's sense of agency and capacity to act in the world. And to work cooperatively with others to act in the world, you know, a sense of solidarity. But maybe because we've taken up an hour of your time, which is what we had agreed to when we first started this. Maybe we're going to have to take up some of these other questions around politics in a future conversation as well, because we'd like to have you back.
Yeah,
and maybe,
I think that'd be good. So,
do you have any closing thoughts or questions that you'd like?
Well, no, I just think it's really interesting because this is a nice circle back to when we first started, and David, we were talking about how it's not really talking about science fiction is kind of on the fringes, right, of doing stuff, especially like in education, right, where you give it to in a teacher prep program, as soon as you're like, what, we're going to read this story? Like we're able to read this story? Like is this rigorous enough? And yeah, that's going to have to be a whole nother conversation. But I think it's really interesting when we bring this back to about science fiction, and one of the reasons maybe, as you spoke to, with how maybe it seems a little like we shouldn't talk about it, because it's related to popular culture.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then I'm just thinking about a recent example where maybe sometimes if the answer is not in the school and in how we're doing education right now, what if we look to examples with how people are using, you know, science fiction, popular culture to combine it with the politics, and also kind of actually maneuvering within neoliberalism and this whole social imaginary that we're in, right? Because when you have AOC and Elon playing Among Us on Twitch, and that got how many hundreds of thousands of viewers, but also, you know, like I think it just also shows us that there's different ways of experimenting, right, and finding those different ways that we can then incorporate right into a different vision of the future. But again, that's going to have to be a whole nother conversation because I don't understand Twitch.
Well, those are really different uses of technology too, Amy. Like those are creative uses of technology, whereas like the adaptive learning model is prescriptive. It's just, you know, spitting back the same patterns at the student over and over again. So that seems like a really good point. Yeah, a good point. Well, listen, it's been wonderful to talk to you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.
And yeah, we'll look forward to reading more of your work. And we'll put a link into the Policy Futures call. I don't know if it's still ongoing, but we can certainly put a link in just to give people an idea of what that is, since you brought it up a couple times.
Sounds good.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys.
Okay, thanks.